Okay, now let's look at chapter 8. In the past two chapters, chapter 6, we talked about the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Chapter 7, we talked a little bit about the classical school. And chapter 8 focuses in on the Keynesian School of economics. So again, as we discussed in class, John Maynard Keynes was a famous economist who, in the 1930s, looked at what was going on around him, both in England and in Europe and globally with the Depression, and sort of came to some conclusions that differed with the classical school of economics. So, as you recall from our last video, the classical school of economics was founded on a couple of basic principles. Flexible prices, yeah, absolutely. Classical school believed in flexible prices and that surpluses and shortages couldn't exist in the long run. Say's law, yep, believed in the Say's law, that in fact production drove the economy and that it wasn't consumption. Laissez-faire in terms of the government sort of keeping a hands-off approach to the economy, yep, absolutely believe that. Self-correcting economy. We spent the whole last video talking about that. But basically believes that the economy in the long run is self-correcting, and in fact, that's the focus of the classical school, is the long run. And when it comes to the aggregate supply or aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, if you recall in my explanation of the self-correcting economy, what is it that shifted once wage rates went down and the price of labor went down? What is it that shifted to bring the economy back into equilibrium? It was short-run aggregate supply. Well, Keynes looked at what was going on around him with the Great Depression and came to the conclusion basically that, in fact, the economy could sort of peter out and could, in fact, enter into a surplus and or shortage in the long run, and view that as part of what was going on. The other part that we'll get to here in a minute, that he basically saw the Great Depression as a failure in demand, in aggregate demand. But we'll get to that here in a minute. When it came to flexible prices, what did Keynes, and I should have mentioned earlier because we did talk about this before, but his big work was the General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, which was published in 1936. And in that, he disagreed. And he said, you know what? Prices aren't necessarily flexible. In fact, they're sticky. Going so that in fact prices could go up, but going down they could in fact be relatively sticky, is the term he used. In terms of Say's law, he didn't believe that supply created its own demand, and that it was production that drove the economy. So no, disagreed with that. Laissez-faire, totally disagreed with that. Believed the government should take an active role in helping to correct the economy. In fact, wrote a number of letters to world leaders like Roosevelt and others during the time, advocating for an enhanced government role. So, self-correcting economy? No. Again, thought that, it's kind of funny. His whole idea of the long run and the self-correcting economy in the long run, his response to that was, well, in the long run, we're all dead. So, no, did not believe that the economy would necessarily reach equilibrium in the long run, and that it could stall out in the case of labor in a labor surplus, which is again what he saw in the environment around him in the 1930s. So the Keynesian School of Economics is completely short run. Right? There's not a focus on the long run like the classical school. And in fact, when it comes to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, what is it that's going to shift or what is it that the Keynesians advocated in terms of shifting? It was aggregate demand. And we'll see that in the next video when we kind of illustrate out and demonstrate what Keynes was talking about.